The blacksmith pulled a cook from a burning wagon. By morning, every fence post held a loaf of fresh bread. The morning sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek, but something was different. Every fence post, every hitching rail, every porch railing held something that shouldn't have been there. Fresh bread. Golden, warm loaves that filled the air with an aroma so rich it stopped horses mid-stride and made grown men weep without knowing why. Nobody could explain it. Nobody except Martha Henderson, who stood on her porch clutching her shawl, watching the townspeople emerge from their homes like sleepwalkers drawn to a miracle they couldn't understand. 24 hours earlier, Martha had been nobody special. Just the baker's widow trying to scrape together enough coin to keep her little shop running in a town that seemed to forget what hope tasted like. Her husband Samuel had died 3 winters back, leaving her with nothing but flour-stained aprons and memories of better times. The fire started just after midnight. Martha had been working late, preparing dough for the morning batch when she heard the rumble of wheels outside. Through her window, she saw the supply wagon racing down Main Street, flames already licking at the canvas covering. The driver was slumped forward, unconscious, while the horses ran wild with terror. She knew what was in that wagon: flour, sugar, salt, all the precious supplies that kept her bakery alive, heading straight for the livery stable where they would take half the town with them when they exploded. Martha ran into the street, her nightgown billowing behind her. The heat hit her face like a physical blow as she reached for the wagon's side rail. The horses were foaming at the mouth, their eyes rolled back in panic. She couldn't stop them, couldn't turn them, couldn't do anything but watch her livelihood and maybe her life disappear in smoke and ash. That's when she heard the hammer. Jake Morrison had been working late too. The blacksmith never seemed to sleep, his forge glowing red through the night as he shaped horseshoes and mended tools for folks who couldn't pay him half what he was worth. He was a big man, arms like tree trunks from years of swinging his hammer, but gentle in a way that made children flock to his shop to watch him work magic with metal. He dropped his hammer and ran toward the burning wagon without hesitation. Martha watched in horror as he grabbed the bridle of the lead horse, his bare hands closing around leather that was already smoldering. The animal reared up, hooves slashing the air inches from his head, but Jake held on. "Get back, Martha," he shouted over the roar of flames. "This whole thing's going to blow." But Martha couldn't move. She watched Jake throw his full weight against the horse's neck, using his body to turn the terrified animals away from the livery stable. The wagon lurched sideways, sparks flying as metal wheels scraped against stone. The horses fought him every step, but Jake was stronger. Step by step, he forced them toward the creek that ran behind the general store. His shirt caught fire, his hair singed, his hands blistered against the hot leather, but he never let go. The wagon hit the creek bank and tilted. Water hissed against burning wood as supplies tumbled into the shallow stream. Jake lunged forward and pulled the unconscious driver from his seat just as the canvas cover went up in a whoosh of flame that lit up half the town. People came running then. Bucket brigades formed. The fire was doused before it could spread, but Jake Morrison lay unconscious in the mud beside the creek, his hands burned raw and his face blackened with smoke. Martha knelt beside him as Doc Henley worked to revive him. In the dying firelight, she could see what they had saved. Sacks of flour, mostly intact. Sugar, salt, yeast. Everything she needed, scattered along the creek bank like gifts from heaven. "Why?" she whispered, not sure if she was talking to Jake or to God. "Why would you risk everything for my supplies?" Jake's eyes fluttered open. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Because this town needs hope more than it needs another horseshoe." Martha spent the rest of the night gathering what could be saved. The flour was damp but usable. The sugar had crystallized but would dissolve. By dawn, she had enough to bake for the entire town. But she couldn't do it alone. Not with Jake unconscious and her own hands shaking from exhaustion and shock. That's when the miracle truly began. Mary Collins appeared first, the preacher's wife with her sleeves rolled up and determination in her eyes. "What do you need?" she asked simply. "I need to bake," Martha said. "All of it. Every bit of flour, every grain of sugar. But I can single quotes T. Then will help." Others came. The banker's daughter, the saloon keeper's wife, even rough men from the mines, their faces scrubbed clean for once, asking what they could do. By sunrise, Martha's small bakery had become the heart of something beautiful. They worked in shifts, mixing, kneading, shaping loaves with hands that had never touched bread dough before. The oven, built by Samuel years ago, glowed steadily as batch after batch went in and came out golden brown. But there was more bread than any bakery should have been able to produce. Loaves multiplied on cooling racks. The smell grew stronger, richer, until it seemed to have weight and substance of its own. Martha tried to count them, but lost track somewhere around 50, then 100. The numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the look on people's faces as they worked together, united by something larger than themselves. Old Henrik, who hadn't spoken to his neighbor Pete in 5 years over a property dispute, found himself kneading dough beside him. Sarah Mitchell, who had been shunned by the church ladies for reasons everyone had forgotten, shaped rolls with gentle hands while they sang hymns together. As the sun climbed higher, Jake Morrison woke up. Doc Henley had bandaged his hands, but he insisted on walking to the bakery despite protests about his condition. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the scene inside. Dozens of people working together, their faces flushed with heat and purpose, creating something beautiful from disaster. "Martha," he said, and she turned to him with flour in her hair and tears in her eyes. "Jake, you shouldn't be up. Your hands ... They'll heal." He looked around at all the bread, at all the people. But this ... this is something else entirely. That's when young Tommy Patterson burst through the door, his eyes wide with wonder. "Miss Martha, you got to see this. There's bread everywhere. On every fence post, every rail, every place a person might rest and need feeding." They followed him outside, and Martha's heart nearly stopped. It was true. Somehow, while they had been working inside, loaves had appeared throughout the town. Not scattered randomly, but placed with care where hungry travelers might find them. Where the poor might take what they needed without shame. Where anyone who needed hope might find it in the simple gift of warm bread. Jake stood beside her, his bandaged hands hanging at his sides. "How?" Martha whispered. "Does it matter?" Jake replied, "Look at them." All around the town, people were emerging from their homes. Families gathered on porches, breaking bread together. Strangers shared loaves with newcomers. Children laughed as they tore off chunks of crust still warm from unknown ovens. Mrs. Kelly, who had been widowed last month and barely had money for salt, found 3 perfect loaves on her windowsill. The Jameson family, who had lost their farm to drought, discovered enough bread to feed their 6 children for a week. But it wasn't just about the bread anymore. It was about what the bread represented. In a town where people had grown hard and separate, where everyone looked out only for themselves, something had shifted. Martha walked through the streets, watching the miracle unfold. The barber was sharing his morning meal with a drifter who had been sleeping behind his shop. The hotel owner was setting out tables for anyone who wanted to sit and eat together. Jake followed her, moving slowly but steadily despite his injuries. "This is your doing," Martha said to him. "If you hadn't saved those supplies ... all quotes." "No." Jake shook his head. "This is what happens when people remember they're not alone." The bread lasted 3 days. 3 days of abundance where no one went hungry, where neighbors became friends, where the hard edges of frontier life softened just enough to let kindness through. On the 4th morning, the last loaves were gone, but the change remained. People still gathered on porches to share their meals. The church ladies still visited Mrs. Kelly every afternoon. The miners still helped load supplies at the general store without being asked. Martha reopened her bakery the following week. The townspeople had taken up a collection to replace her equipment and restock her shelves. But more than that, they had become her family in a way that surprised everyone, including herself. Jake Morrison healed slowly, his hands scarred but strong. He returned to his forge, but now children weren't the only ones who visited his shop. Adults came too, drawn by the warmth they had discovered in him during those 3 miraculous days. 6 months later, Martha and Jake were married in a ceremony that filled the entire street. The preacher spoke about miracles, but Martha knew the real miracle hadn't been the bread appearing on fence posts. It had been a blacksmith who risked everything to save supplies that weren't even his, and a town that remembered what it meant to care for each other. Years passed. Redemption Creek grew and prospered. New families arrived, drawn by stories of a place where neighbors still looked out for each other. Old-timers would tell the tale of the night the blacksmith saved the baker's supplies, and how by morning every fence post held fresh bread. But they always ended the story the same way, with the reminder that miracles aren't about magic appearing from nowhere. They're about ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things, even when no one is watching, even when it costs them everything they have. Martha Morrison kept baking until she was too old to lift the heavy bags of flour. Jake kept his forge burning until his hands could no longer grip his hammer. They raised 3 children who grew up knowing that the most important ingredient in any recipe wasn't flour or yeast or sugar. It was love. The kind of love that makes a man risk his life for someone else's dreams. The kind of love that turns a disaster into a blessing. The kind of love that appears on fence posts like fresh bread, unexpected but exactly what everyone needed. And on quiet mornings when the sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek, old-timers swore they could still smell that magical bread in the air. Not because it was still there, but because some miracles leave traces that never quite fade away. The town learned that night that heroes don't always wear badges or carry guns. Sometimes they carry hammers and work through the night, shaping more than just metal in their forges. Sometimes they shape hope itself, one act of courage at a time. But the story didn't end with the wedding or even with the peaceful years that followed. Life in the frontier was never simple, and Redemption Creek would face its greatest test 20 years after the night of the burning wagon. The drought came without warning. 3 years of failed crops, dried wells, and dying livestock brought desperation back to the town that had learned to hope. Families packed their belongings and left for greener territories. Businesses shuttered their windows. The railroad company threatened to abandon the route entirely. Martha stood in her bakery, now graying at the temples but still strong, watching the dust devils dance through empty streets. Her flour supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The last shipment had been delayed indefinitely due to the economic collapse spreading across the territory. Jake's forge had gone cold for the first time in 30 years. With no crops to harvest, there were no tools to repair, no horses to shoe. His hands, still scarred from that long-ago night, remained idle while he watched their town slowly die. The bank foreclosed on a dozen properties in a single week. Sheriff Coleman, once a young deputy who had helped carry buckets during the fire, now had the grim task of evicting families who had nowhere else to go. "We need another miracle," Martha told her husband one evening as they sat on their porch, watching another family load their possessions onto a wagon bound for California. Jake squeezed her hand with fingers that still remembered the heat of burning leather. Miracles don't come when you call them. They come when people need them most and are willing to sacrifice everything to make them happen. That night, Martha couldn't sleep. She walked through her empty bakery, running her hands over the cooling racks that had once held hundreds of loaves. The oven Samuel had built sat cold and dark, its purpose seemingly forgotten. She found herself thinking about the night everything changed. Not just the fire or the rescue, but the moment when the entire town had come together in her small shop. The way strangers had become family. The way individual sacrifice had transformed into collective hope. By morning, she had made her decision. Martha spent the day visiting every remaining household in Redemption Creek. She knocked on doors, sat at kitchen tables, and listened to stories of fear and uncertainty. But she also shared her own story, reminding people of what they had accomplished together before. "We saved this town once," she told Henrik, now in his 70s but still stubborn as a mule. "We can save it again." "That was different," Henrik replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "We had supplies then. We had something to work with. Now we have nothing." "We have each other," Martha insisted. "That's what made the miracle possible before. Not the flour or the yeast or even the bread. It was people choosing to hope together." One by one she convinced them. Not with false promises or empty optimism, but with the simple reminder that they had faced impossible odds before and won. The plan was ambitious beyond reason. They would pool every resource they had left. Every grain of wheat, every coin hidden in coffee tins, every skill and talent that remained. They would create something that would draw people back to Redemption Creek, something that would convince the railroad to stay, something that would prove their town was worth saving. They would hold a harvest festival. In the middle of a drought, with no harvest to celebrate. Jake thought his wife had lost her mind when she explained the idea. "Martha, darling, I love you, but there's no harvest. There are no crops. There's barely any people left to attend a festival." "Then we'll make our own harvest," she replied with the same determination that had once driven her to run toward a burning wagon. "We'll show everyone what Redemption Creek is really made of." The word spread through the remaining families like wildfire. The idea was crazy enough to capture imagination and desperate enough to feel necessary. People who had been packing to leave started unpacking instead. Sarah Mitchell, now the town's unofficial leader of charitable works, organized the women into committees. Mary Collins, the preacher's wife, began writing letters to neighboring towns, inviting them to witness something extraordinary. Jake fired up his forge for the first time in months, not to make horseshoes or repair plows, but to create decorative ironwork for the festival booths. His hammer rang through the quiet streets like a bell calling people to church. The men organized construction crews to build stages and pavilions from salvaged lumber. They dug new wells, knowing they might find only dust but digging anyway because the act of trying was itself a form of hope. Young Tommy Patterson, now a grown man with children of his own, used his carpentry skills to build carnival games from scrap wood and bent nails. His wife Emma organized the school children to create banners and decorations from whatever fabric they could find. But the centerpiece of the festival would be Martha's contribution. She announced that she would bake enough bread to feed every visitor using the last of her supplies and whatever the town could contribute. "And if we run out of ingredients?" someone asked during a town meeting held in the empty church. Martha smiled, her eyes bright with the same fire that had driven her into the street 20 years ago. "Then we'll make bread from hope and determination." It worked before. The weeks leading up to the festival were unlike anything Redemption Creek had ever experienced. People worked from dawn to dusk, driven by a shared vision that seemed impossible but felt necessary. Neighbors who had been strangers helped each other, creating bonds that went deeper than mere cooperation. The railroad company sent an inspector to evaluate whether the route was worth maintaining. Word of the Harvest Festival had reached their offices, and they were curious about a town crazy enough to throw a celebration in the middle of an economic disaster. 3 days before the festival, supplies began arriving from unexpected sources. A wagon train passing through donated flour and sugar. A cattle drive shared fresh meat. Communities from hundreds of miles away sent representatives with goods and curiosity. But the real miracle was quieter, more personal. Families who had left Redemption Creek began returning, drawn by letters from relatives and rumors of something special happening. The town's population doubled, then tripled as word spread across the territory. Martha worked 18-hour days in her bakery, assisted by every woman in town and several men whose rough hands proved surprisingly gentle with bread dough. The ovens burned continuously, fed by wood donated from every remaining homestead. Jake spent his days creating more than decorations. He forged new tools for farmers who had lost theirs, repaired wagons for families making long journeys to attend the festival, and somehow found time to help with the endless construction projects that transformed their dying town into something magical. The night before the festival, Martha stood in her bakery surrounded by hundreds of loaves. But unlike 20 years ago, she knew exactly how many there were and where everyone would go. The miracle this time wasn't multiplication of bread, but multiplication of community. The festival opened at dawn with a parade that stretched from one end of Main Street to the other. Bands from 5 different towns played together in harmonious cacophony. Children ran alongside decorated wagons, their laughter carrying across the prairie like music. The railroad inspector, a stern man named Clarence Whitmore, watched from the hotel balcony with undisguised amazement. He had expected to find a few dozen desperate people clinging to false hope. Instead, he saw thousands of visitors filling streets that had been empty just weeks before. Martha's bread disappeared within hours, but that was expected. What wasn't expected was the way visitors lingered, reluctant to leave a place that felt so alive with possibility. They toured Jake's forge, admired the restored buildings, and listened to stories of the town's resilience. Business owners who had shuttered their stores reopened them for the weekend, and by Sunday evening had made enough profit to stay open permanently. The hotel filled beyond capacity, with visitors sleeping in the stable and thanking their hosts for the privilege. But the real transformation was in the people of Redemption Creek themselves. They had rediscovered not just their ability to hope, but their power to create the change they wanted to see. Inspector Whitmore found Martha on the final evening of the festival, as she sat on her porch watching families reluctantly prepare for their journeys home. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, tipping his hat respectfully, "I came here to write a report recommending that we abandon this route. Instead, I'm going to recommend that we build a depot here, a permanent station that can serve the entire region." Martha smiled, her hands folded in her lap like a woman who had just watched another impossible thing become possible. "What changed your mind? I've seen a lot of towns, ma'am. Rich towns, poor towns, growing towns, dying towns. But I've never seen a town that could create prosperity from nothing but determination and community spirit. That's the kind of place the railroad wants to serve." Within a year, Redemption Creek had tripled in size. The railroad depot brought new business, new families, and new opportunities. But the town never forgot the lessons learned during those desperate weeks when they chose hope over surrender. Martha and Jake lived to see their grandchildren playing in streets that bustled with activity. They watched their town become a model for other communities facing their own disasters, a place where people came to learn how ordinary citizens could create extraordinary change. The bakery that had once been the heart of a single miracle became the heart of a thriving community. Martha trained dozens of apprentices over the years, but she always made sure they understood that the most important ingredient in any recipe wasn't something you could buy or measure. It was the willingness to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, and the courage to do whatever it took to make that belief a reality. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the morning sun hit the town at the perfect angle, visitors swore they could smell the aroma of fresh bread coming from every direction at once. Not because there were ovens on every corner, but because some miracles become so much a part of a place that they season the very air with hope. The story of Redemption Creek spread far beyond the boundaries of any single territory. It became legend, then inspiration, then finally a simple truth that anyone could understand. When people choose to stand together, when they're willing to sacrifice for something bigger than themselves, when they refuse to surrender to despair, miracles don't just happen. They become inevitable.